Hey guys, Matt, IronTrap Garage, working on the 39 Forgotten Hot Rod project. So after getting the dash all sorted, I was really happy about that. Left it sit in the car for, I don't know, a few weeks now, a couple weeks. You saw we did the Patronic conversion. So now we're ready to just paint the section that I modified, put the dash back in for its final fit up, and start bolting stuff back together. And then also I can start wiring things like the ignition switch, the starter button, stuff like that, so that we can start this thing inside the car. We're trying to get this car and the 34 to the point where you can basically get in the car and turn the key even though it's not done, and they're mobile and we don't have to jump all these wires, do all this janky stuff. So that's where I'm kind of at for both these cars. This 39 we're going to handle a little differently than the 34 because we're going to just spray bomb the dash where I repaired it, because we want it to look old and weathered and I don't want to go too crazy on it. So I'm going to pull the dash out, probably tape up around all the other areas and just dust some paint on with the gauges out, and then we can start putting it back together. Alright, let's see how much this thing fights us. Really all that's holding it in is this windshield crank here. I think. Yep, there we go. Pull that out. Okay. Sweet. Alright, so I was getting ready to clean everything up to start just dusting some paint onto this thing, and I realized that I had not sorted out putting a bulb holder in this hole we had for the indicator light. So we need to take a step back real quick because we don't want to be welding on this with paint on, fresh paint on the front side. So I usually keep these little bulb holders out of the back of gauge panels and dashboards and stuff like that when I come across them. A lot of times you can just cut them off because they're like bent and spot welded if you can't get to it easily. And these are really nice because you can just set them on wherever and weld them in place. These are the bulb holder. This is the old style bulb holder that goes in there. Just basically has a little spring in it with a wire with a contact. And I try and pick ones, obviously, the wire isn't all fragile. And this fits in the back side, and the little groove, or the little rib on the end of the bulb holder sits right into that recess there, and that holds it, and then it sits up above like that. Now the hard part is, this is like a brass type material here. It's hard to see. I started sanding on it a little bit, but you can see there's like a brass tone underneath of this, like cadmium plating. So you can't just weld this. It's not a magnetic material. So it is not a like material to this steel, so we can't just weld it like we would normally. So what you can do is braze it. You can use a torch. I actually have started using more with the TIG and silicon bronze filler rod, and you can TIG braze something. So that's what I have here, is some 1/16 silicon bronze, and we'll just fixture this little piece or rest it in place to where I roughly want it, and then I'll strike an arc, and I'll basically, you're melting the filler wire between the two of them, and it sticks, and it works quite well. It's the same as if you did it with a torch. It's just, for me, TIG's a little more controllable. I'm not going to heat everything up around it, and we can just quickly do that without melting this little tiny piece away. So I usually run it around like 40 amps, 35 amps for this, just enough to melt this filler wire, and just shove it in there and just kind of melt it in, and it works pretty well. And I'm welding on DC as I'm moving my torch here. I forgot to mention that. Doing some DC welding. I usually try and just get a dab on there, and then I melt it between the two of them. Little dab. Put most of my heat on the steel. As soon as I see it melt onto the brass piece, because that has a lower melting point, I pull the heat off. There we go. That's basically it. That's all we need. All right, so I'll just give you a quick shot of this. So you're not laying stack of dimes when you're brazing, so you just kind of lay it in there. Like I said, I start on the upper piece that's the softer or has a lower melting point material, and as soon as I get that silicon bronze to sit in there and start melting, as soon as it wicks into the top piece, the softer or more fragile piece, if you will, I then move it down onto the steel or whatever other material. So you can see it fitted in place. It's nice and sturdy. I'm sure I could break it off. It's not a structural weld, but just like brazing with a torch, it works quite well. I've used it for all different sorts of stuff, but this is another good example of something you can do with a TIG and a different type of rod, and minimizes, a flame or lighten up the oxyacetylene torch. It saves me some time and hassle and mess. Alright, so this paint just got dried up, and what I'm actually doing is just I'm knocking it down with some steel wool to try and take away the hard line. So I actually used some self-etching primer because I wanted something that was kind of flat. So I'm just going back over it to kind of dull up the paint now, just to make it kind of look like the rest of it. I'm not into the fake patina thing too much, but I also don't want this thing to stick out like a sore thumb. So I was hitting it kind of hard right up here where the hard line was, where I had it taped off. And after going over it a little bit, since there was paint underneath this top part, we'll start to cut through and kind of dull it out. We don't want to go too hard in here where it's just bare metal underneath. It's just want the primer to stay dry. So just by doing that, kind of dulled everything up, got rid of this hard line here, and it'll look equally as perfectly shitty as the rest of it. It's my tagline. So I'll get this scuffed up a little bit more, and then we're ready to start putting it back together and putting it in the car and trying to wire up some of these switches and stuff. Alright, so I got the dash all mounted up, and I just took the steering or the ignition switch off of the factory column, and I wanted to show you guys. So in this car, we're going to actually use the original ignition switch off the 39 Ford that we had already broken the bolts loose previously, so I knew everything was freed up. But we're going to be using this as our ignition switch, and then we'll have a starter button, kind of like pretty much like stock. So these are pretty simple. On the back, there's just three little posts, one that's battery, one that's coil, one that's gauge. So of course we can hook our battery power from the actual battery cable right up to that. We'll fuse it, of course, just in case anything happens in between there. Then we can hook a wire from here that'll go to our coil or our ignition system, which we already wired up. We have a wire coming inside, and then we have one that's for the gauge. And this is basically just giving power to the dashboard gauges. The other side of this is what butts up against the back of the ignition switch or the column drop, and there's a little swivel piece in here. So this basically just touches the contact here. It's like spring loaded, and a lot of times I've seen these where they go bad, and it's just because this wears down or the spring starts to lose its springiness and it'll lose contact. But basically that stays touching on the power section, and it rotates like this. So when it's in the off position, it's going to be in between these two contacts, so there's going to get no power at all, obviously. And then when you slide it to the on, it's going to connect that piece there and give it power to the coil and the gauges, of course. So super duper simple. It's really easy, and I like using these when I can. especially in this car. I think it'll work out pretty well. So all I did already is I went ahead and took some sandpaper and a scuff pad and just scuffed everything up and cleaned it up, got all the contacts cleaned up, make sure they're not dirty, and then did the same thing to the bottom of the nuts and all the washers and everything that go on the back side. So really simple piece. You can buy all these pieces reproduction to put them back together if you get a good column drop. There's not much that really goes bad in them other than if they get abused or rusty. So I'm going to put this all back together, and then we can start running our wires to our ignition switch, and we should be able to get some power to the ignition switch and also to the starter switch here real soon. Alright, so I got the switch, the guts of the switch put back in, and this is the actual switch here on the column, or the column drop, that you just go from off to on, and that's all it does. So I like to do just a sanity check just to make sure that everything's good before we wire it up and you go to start the car and can't figure out why you can't get power. I have had it where you put the switch together wrong, or maybe the contacts aren't quite right in it, and I've gotten no power. So I have my voltmeter here set up for continuity, so I'm going to go off the bottom post and touch it, and then we're going to go on the one of the other posts here. Both top ones should get power. So when we flip that switch on, it should go to 0 or very close to it, depending on how well I'm holding it. And it looks like we are. So you can see the switching of it, and I'll just check the other post as well, just to make sure that it's getting the same thing. So there we go. Yep, so our switch is working good. So if we power this up and run the wires to the right stuff, we should be able to get power to our ignition system and our starter button. Alright, so I was digging through the wiring that Mike had started bundling up for me here, and that saved me a bunch of time, which is nice. And so he's got pulled out some of the different wires that we need here. I found the little bundle that is the ignition switch and starter switch stuff, and this Speedway harness is kind of set up for like GM switches, which of course will work great if you're using a GM column. You can plug right in, everything's great, but we're doing kind of a mashup of early Ford stuff, and that's not going to work. So luckily the wires are all labeled, so this one switch here has pretty much got pretty much everything we need on it. So it's got a red wire, that's our ignition switch power, so we're going to clip that off, put a ring terminal on it, and that will go up to power our switch on the column. And then we have our ignition switch start. So we are going to take that wire off, and we're going to send that over to the push button on the dash that's going up here, and that'll be our actual starter button. So we'll cut that out. There's a little jumper that goes over to another plug here that is for our accessory for the ignition switch, so it just jumps power over to another plug, and then when you flip the switch, it sends the accessory power. So we really don't need that in this car. I think it's kind of overkill because there's not going to be anything that's accessory. We're going to wire some stuff up, and you just got to use common sense to make sure you turn the radio off or the heater off when you are actually running the car. We don't need to leave it on for accessories, so I think it's okay. So we're going to get rid of that, or I'm going to clip it and probably bundle it up in the wiring in case anybody wants to use it someday in the future, but we will bundle that up and get it out of the way, and of course also cut it so that it's not a live wire bouncing around. So I'm going to get these all cut up, put some ring terminals on, get them connected up to the ignition switch, and then we can put our ground and power wire to the battery and the chassis ground for the fuse box, and then we should be able to test and see if we can crank the engine over and get power to the ignition switch, which will be really cool. All right, so I got the wires run from the ignition switch sending power over to the starter switch here. I just ran some constant power to the starter switch how it normally is. Now, I changed the starter switch here. We got to drill a little bit bigger of a hole to fit this. This is one out of my stash that's actually a 2-prong starter switch. The one that's in the Ford as the factory actually is a grounding switch, so it basically touches the ground on the outside clips where it clips in. When it connects that, so when you hit the button, it connects the ground in the switch and sends it to the starter solenoid. So obviously with the way we have the car wired now, with it being negative ground and sending positive signal to the starter solenoid, we can't use that. So if we would have touched the ground, it would have sent a ground to the starter solenoid, which wouldn't have worked. So I got this switch here, which is a different style that uses 2 prongs. So we ran a positive constant power in, and then we have our wire running out to our starter solenoid that basically is what switches the solenoid on and off. So I have that all sitting in there. I just got to drill a hole then once I'm sure everything's good, and we'll walk you around to the other side. So I have the wire ran on the inside of the car, just to keep it a little cleaner and stuff off the firewall. And then what I have is out here, I'm going to set you guys down, because I have the wire sneaked out of the firewall here. We'll put a little grommet in there, but that wire runs up from the switch and we'll go right to the solenoid, and when we hit the button, that will send power to the solenoid, and we'll excite our starter solenoid and get a switch in here. So I'm going to put a little ring terminal on here. I've been using this Eastwood crimperite connector set. The set comes with basically the heart of it, and the part that's really kick-ass is this little crimper that comes with it. Super handy. I for years have used other old kind of crappy ones, or just done it with the cutters, and it happens with varied results. So the nice thing about this is I already have my shrink wrap. So you put that on, you line up your color here. So we got a blue connector, line that up, put it on, and it just makes like such a nice, and it's ratcheting, and when you put it all the way tight to where it's crimped fully, then it releases and you have a really nice crimp. So that's how it does. It works really nice. It has all the different sizes there you commonly use, and you can slip our shrink wrap up on top of that, and we're good to go once we heat that. And I can mount it right here on this. So grab my heat gun. Alright, so I got all the wiring for the ignition hooked up and the starter switch and all that stuff, and then I started looking, where is the main power wire and main ground to feed the fuse box? There was nothing on the wiring harness that says anything anywhere. I went through every wire, went through the whole diagram, and I couldn't find it. Well, it turns out I think I have a hunch here, and it makes sense. I just looked for the thickest positive wire coming out of the harness, and then also I found the thickest ground wire. So the ground wire I have actually hooked up underneath on the body. I have the body linked with a ground wire, and oops, there we go. So I have the ground wire underneath here, actually connected to where the fuse box goes through the body, and so that was my ground. The thick red wire actually said starter solenoid on it, and I read through the instructions and mentioned about putting a fusible link or some kind of fuse in there between that before hooking it in. Well, that made sense to me that generally when you mess with some of the modern cars I mess with, usually the fusible link is at the power feed that goes to any main, like feed into a fuse box or anything like that, or into the vehicle. So I crimped this all up, and I'm just going to test here to see. So this, I have my link hooked up, and I'm just going to hang that on there, and let's see if our starter switch will work. And that'll tell me if I was correct, because the starter switch is hooked up through the fuse box. Oh yeah. So we're good. So my hunch was correct. So that is how you feed if you have one of these Speedway fuse boxes and you aren't wiring it exactly like a GM, and you're kind of just using it as a universal job. You need to kind of, for the power and ground, if you don't hook anything up, you won't get it to the fuse box. So now that I have that, actually the thing could technically start. So I'm gonna hook that wire up there with put the nut on so that it's tight and we have a good connection, and then I'm gonna try and use the ignition switch and see if we can get this thing to fire. Alright, so I took my multimeter and checked our ignition switch and it looks like it's working. So in theory, this thing should fire. So I don't have a gas pedal hooked up yet, but let's see if this thing will do its thing with the switch in the dash. Make sure we're neutral. So we send power to our ignition. With our ignition switch. Let's try it again. So switch on. Oh yeah. So there's our factory switch. Turn the switch on and starts right up. Super awesome. Alright, so we did a variety of stuff today. We got the dash pulled out. I cleaned everything up. We welded in or brazed in that little bulb holder. We painted the dash, scuffed it to make it look old, and then we finally got the wiring hooked up for the fuse box. For the starter, and of course for the ignition, and you guys just heard it ran with a switch as it should inside the car. So I like to call these, as you guys know that watch the channel, small victories. With working on these cars, it is such a long process and it's really easy to get discouraged. I find that it's really helpful to do these small victories. So at the end of a lot of my projects, day of work, I try and get to a point where you can do something that is satisfying. So in this case, it was making it run with the switches and button in the car, which is really awesome, and I'm psyched. So now that the thing runs with the switches in the car and the fuse box has power and ground and everything hooked up, now we can start working on some different stuff like charging and some things like that. I want to wire up the voltage regulator for the generator, but I need to make a bracket for the generator off camera. I've been kind of mocking up some different stuff, trying to figure out what my game plan is, and I need to make a new bracket for the generator that will hold it in place, the actual adjustable bracket, because it was different on the T-Bird, and I don't think it actually came with the engine, to be honest. And then I also need to work on the radiator. We have a good radiator that I won at that auction where Mike was bidding for me at the online auction, and it is a 39 Ford radiator, which is awesome, and it's in phenomenal condition, but it is a stock radiator set up for a flathead. So I need to braze or fill 2 of the ports, and I think I might try and tackle that myself. I've been doing a little bit of that TIG brazing like you guys saw, and I'm pretty sure I can handle it. So I'm gonna work on that in one of these upcoming videos, show you guys how to braze shut those 2 extra ports on the radiator, and we can get the cooling system hooked up, get it charging, do all that stuff, finally put the front end back on, which will be really exciting, and it'll start really looking like a car. The other thing that we kind of decided through just some talking with Mike and I is we're trying to get this project on the road with not a lot of extra work or backstepping. So for now, I think we're actually going to leave the teapot carburetor on. It starts and runs really well. I know everybody was saying, and I've read up on it, that the distributor in these with the Loadmatic distributor, they don't play well with multiple carburetors or really any other carburetor other than these ones that were made for it. So I think for now, to save us getting into a whole bunch of work, we're gonna leave the Patronics in. I'm gonna just get some kind of air cleaner. So if anybody has a ratty, like T-Bird air cleaner or something to fit a teapot, let me know, because I'd like to purchase one. And we're just gonna keep moving with this carburetor. It'll be plenty fine to move the car along. This engine was restored not horribly long ago, so everything's been gone through. So we're just gonna leave that carburetor on for now and just drive and get some miles on it. And then maybe later in our driving, we will swap some stuff out, but for now, it's pretty good. So big day for the 39 Forgotten Hot Rod. I appreciate you guys following along and watching all the videos. And yeah, we're gonna be on the road here soon with a couple of these cars. So thanks guys for watching. Catch you later.